Hey everyone, welcome back. I wanted to describe an experience that I had a little over 10 years ago at this point while I was a senior in college. And it was my first major, lucid, sort of powerful experience on an astral realm. And I've had similar experiences leading up to that, and I've had similar experiences since then, but I remember this one being one of the most distinctly, obviously, powerfully what it was kinds of experiences. Like when I woke up or came to after it, I knew what it was I had been doing, I knew where I'd been, and I sort of had an idea of why I was there. And it was more lucid and more sort of vivid than any experience that I had had up until that point. And since then, it's one of the most powerful and most vivid and real feeling experiences that I've had. But anyway, I thought it would be a good sort of starting off point for me to talk about these kinds of experiences that I've had on this channel. I'll start with the experience and then I'll come back afterwards for a more in-depth explanation. So the night before I had the experience, I remember I was doing some sort of all-nighter, trying to stay up as late as possible. So I was feeling kind of tired, but I remember there being a really distinct and almost abrupt change in the way that I felt. So it wasn't like a tiredness that came over me. It was like a gut punch. It was like a feeling that told me you need to go to sleep right now. And there was like a pull into the state that I found myself in afterwards. And it was distinct and different from anything that I experienced up until that point that I can remember. But it was like if I didn't go to sleep, there would be problems. So when I felt that, I immediately said, okay, closed my eyes and lay down. And the next thing I knew is that I remember standing in what looked like a clearing or like a field or a meadow on the edge of a forest. So I could see the tree line, and there were sort of flowers and grass and stuff like that in the meadow leading up to the tree line. And I remember feeling kind of lightweight. There was still gravity, like I was still walking through the field, but I remember feeling much lighter. And I noticed that the air itself even looked like it was giving off a sort of golden light. Like not only was light hitting things in the field, like the trees or the flowers and stuff, it was like the air itself had a golden, bright quality. And that's as best as I can describe it. It also looked like everything, like the grass, the flowers, even the trees themselves were kind of glowing. It was a little bit like that effect that you might see in like a soap opera where things like are a bit soft, although things were not blurry. Like it was very clear and very sharp, but at the same time visually sort of vibrating light, and that's as best as I can describe it. So I remember finding myself in that field and seeing those things. And the next thing I noticed was that also in that field or the meadow, there was a little structure. It looked like just a shack with sort of 4 posts and a roof, but no walls. And there was also a floor. And that was a little funny to see. And I immediately noticed that inside the structure in this meadow or in this clearing, there were 2 beings, 2 people. One of them was a woman who, one of the first things I noticed was that she was gorgeous. Like she was kind of dark skinned. She may have been Native American, but I couldn't put a specific ethnicity on her. But she was dark skinned, and she had long black hair coming down to maybe her waist or in the middle of her back. And she was totally naked. And also she was very tall. Like she must have been 8, 9, or 10 feet tall. Like she was noticeably much larger than a normal person should be. So I noticed her, and the next thing I noticed was the second person, or the second being, who was seated sort of cross-legged on the floor of this shack or the structure. And he looked like a sort of middle-aged, dark-skinned, also possibly Native American man, but he was covered in tattoos, and he had like some jewelry on, and he had like things in his ears, gauges, they looked like gauges or something like that, covered in tattoos. And he was holding a baby, like an infant, like a baby young enough to not be able to speak. He was holding the baby in one arm, and he was muttering words either to himself or to the baby while sort of rubbing his hand along the child in his arm. And I was immediately put off by that, and I was immediately knew that something was not correct. And so I felt like in that space, that's where I began to actually sort of intuit what was actually happening, as opposed to just being like amazed by the fact that I found myself in this experience. And as I took a look, it seemed to me that the man, who I'll call the shaman, who was sort of muttering, I can only imagine, incantations or spells or something over the baby he had in his arm, was working for the woman. So I understood that she was directing him and encouraging him to do what he was doing, and I immediately got a very negative vibe from both of them. So even though she looked gorgeous, I did not have a good feeling coming from her, or definitely not from the sort of shaman character sitting on the ground cross-legged, sort of doing something to the baby. And the shaman sort of character was regular human size, so he was sitting cross-legged on the ground, but I could tell he was not the same sort of giant status as the woman. So having perceived all this and feeling that it was incorrect or that something was wrong, I immediately became sort of intuitively aware of why I was there. And I was there to try to stop what they were doing. So I next remember walking up to both of them, and the whole time the woman, who had no tattoos, no markings on her body or anything, just really tall, really gorgeous, and very naked, didn't say a thing. She just stared at me the entire time I was walking up to her. And I remember I wanted to stop them, but I didn't know how. But I remember a knife materializing in my hand, and I had to jump up to stab the tall woman in, I guess, what I thought was the heart. So on her left, but my right. I jumped up to stab her, and I had my arm sort of raised up, and I hit her in the chest with my arm raised up as sort of an indicator of how tall she was. But she didn't blink, she didn't make a noise, she didn't say anything, she just stared at me the entire time with kind of like a half smile on her face. And I don't know what I did, I don't know if that had any effect, but as soon as I did that, I remember being like pulled back, or like I was like flying backwards. I got the sense that I was returning to my body. And during that process, I could sort of see the trees moving farther away and see them moving farther away and see the field moving farther away. Then I remember she spoke, and I was still wondering who she was. And she said something to the effect that she was, and she used this term, the monitor for the Midwest. And I didn't fully understand what that meant, but at the time I was living in Ohio. I was going to school in Ohio. So the Midwest made sense. And I remember hearing that reverberate in my mind, like, I'm the monitor for the Midwest. And after that, I woke up. So the feeling of waking up after this was not like waking up after sleep, or waking up normal sleep, or waking up after a regular dream. There was no sort of grogginess or anything like that. I was instantly awake and aware of my body, and it didn't feel like I had any sort of process of coming to. I was instantly awake. I was perfectly flat in my bed, and I remember my entire body felt like it was vibrating with electricity or something like that. It was a little bit like when your hand or your foot falls asleep or goes numb, only that's uncomfortable. And it wasn't uncomfortable, but it was vibration and tingles, but like in a good way. So it didn't feel like I had lost any feeling or anything like that, but it was just like a surge running through me. And that's the best way I can describe it. And after a little bit, that sort of surge feeling died down, and I started to feel like I was my regular self again. And I began to reflect on the experience, because that was something that I sort of knew was significant, and I had an idea that I had just been to an astral realm, but I didn't really sort of understand everything that was going on, or I didn't really have like a previous description that I had read or heard of that described something similar. That was my experience, and that was, and still is to this day, one of the most powerful sort of astral realm experiences that I have had. So with that, I'll go into a little bit more on the nature of dreaming and the kinds of experiences that we can have access to as a result of entering other states of consciousness.